Gordon Allport said that we're all snowflakes. He didn't mean it in the sense that we're very fragile individuals that will break as soon as we're offended by anything, like many people use it nowadays. No, Gordon Allport meant it in the sense that we are all radically different. Every individual is unique. He argued it was potentially pointless to discuss common traits, which is interesting because he's the one who really started trait theorists. What? He said a lot of interesting things, came up with a whole vocabulary term set that we don't really use today. So why don't we even talk about Gordon Allport in the psychology of personality? For two main reasons. One, he's basically the father of personality. If I ask you who's the daddy of personality, the answer is Gordon Allport. The other reason is he basically started trait theories. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of different trait theorists in the class of psychology of personality, but today we're going to talk about Gordon Allport's ideas on traits. I love this stuff because I'm Professor Alan Girding and I love psychology. So if Gordon Allport came up with a whole bunch of terms we don't even use nowadays, and we only talk about him for two main reasons, that he's the father of personality and that he inspired trait theorists, we can get through this relatively simply. We're going to talk about his ideas on traits, and we'll do a translation game. These are the terms that he used, but this is kind of how we mean them today. We also need to talk about the life of Allport, and finally we're going to talk about his assessment technique. So without further ado, the life of Allport. His father was a drug dealer in Canada, but eventually the law came knocking on his door, literally knocking on his front door, and he literally supposedly ran with his family out the back door over the fence and fled to Indiana, America. That's where he had Gordon Allport. Born in Indiana, 1897. The mother supposedly was very strict, had very strong religious beliefs. This is a mouse, by the way. The reason I'm holding on to this is because I'm using this to click through my cheat sheet. So if you're wondering why the heck is Professor Girding holding on to a mouse, it's because I'm using it as my cheat sheet. Anyway, the mother, very religious, had rules. They weren't allowed to dress in bright clothing. They weren't allowed to play cards, because cards are the tools of the devil. Yet the father was a drug dealer, so whatever. Gordon Allport didn't really tell us too much about his childhood. Why? We're going to learn that Gordon Allport thought that children weren't very interesting, that they had little to no personality in infancy and toddlerhood. A fully grown person is as different from their childhood selves than an oak tree is to the acorn. That's what Gordon Allport said. So the reason he didn't tell us too much about his childhood is he believed you shouldn't even talk about your childhood because it's not important. What? That's a pretty radical thing to be saying, but that's what Gordon Allport said. What he did reveal about his childhood was he was kind of a loner. I fashioned my own circle of activities. It was a select circle, for I never fitted the general boy assembly. I suffered agonies on the playground. I never got on with my brothers. They didn't like me, and they weren't kind, and I couldn't possibly compete with them. They were all a little more masculine in type than I was. He considered himself skillful, but not in any of those athletic masculine things. He considered himself skillful with words. Early on, he admitted feelings of inferiority, and he followed his older brother Floyd all over the place academically. Floyd went to Harvard, earned his PhD in psychology. Guess what? That's exactly what Gordon Allport did. Gordon Allport also is known to have said that he published several articles that were of no great importance compared to his brother Floyd. So, in his opinion, he just sucked compared to his brother. So Gordon Allport graduated from undergraduate school the same time that Floyd graduated with his PhD. Eventually, when Allport did go to get his PhD, he wrote it on a dissertation called An Experimental Study in the Traits of Personality. He spent 2 years studying abroad, returned to Harvard, and he offered a course all about the study of the psychology of personality. And that, boom, is the formal beginning of the psychology of personality. That's one of the big reasons why we're talking about Gordon Allport right here and now. But enough about his accolade and what he did and how he started psychology of personality. Let's talk about his interaction with Freud. You know what? Instead of me explaining this story, I should just let Gordon Allport explain the story in his own words. Trudy, roll the footage.
You want to hear about my one encounter with Freud? It did turn out to be very significant in my professional development, so I'll tell you the story briefly. Not long after I finished college, I found myself in Vienna. And that time, Freud, of course, was renowned, but not perhaps so much so as a little later. At any rate, I wrote him a note and announced that I was in Vienna, that no doubt he'd be glad to know it. And he was very courteous. In his own hand, he wrote me a note, invited me to his office at a certain time. So I went to the famous Berggasse office, papered in red burlap paper, really, with pictures of dreams. And exactly at the appointed time, he opened the door from his inner office and invited me in, smilingly, and I sat down, and he said nothing. So it suddenly occurred to me that it was up to me to have a reason for calling on him. But actually, I didn't have any. I was just curious. But I fished around my mind, and I came up with an event on the tram car coming out to his office that I thought would interest him. He was a little boy, about 4 years old. And he obviously had a dirt phobia at that age. His mother was a housefrau that was well starched, very prim, and the little boy would say he didn't want to sit there, it's dirty, and he didn't want that man to sit next to him, he was dirty. And so it went, and the whole trip. Well, I thought this might interest Freud to know how early a dirt phobia could be set. He listened till I'd finished. Then he fixed his therapeutic eye on me and said, "And was that little boy you?" It was not, honestly. The fact is that Freud, with his tendency to see pathological traits, and most of his people came to see him were patients, of course, it was natural. He'd break through my defenses and get down to business, you see. But actually, he mistook my motives. If he had said, well, here's a brassy young American youth or a tourist who is imposing on my good nature and time, he would have been somewhere near correct, I think. But to ascribe my motivation to the unconscious in this case was definitely wrong. So in thinking that over in subsequent months and years, it occurred to me there might be a place for another type of theory of personality and motivation.
The quote was that little boy you? According to Gordon Allport, this whole interaction with Freud was not just uncomfortable and awkward, but it was traumatic. In fact, he pretty much took a knee right then and there and declared, "I believe that psychology shouldn't have anything to do with this Freudian bullcrap." He basically had three premises that he stuck with his theory. He said, the unconscious shouldn't even be talked about. It only dominates unhealthy people. Talk about the unconscious if you're not healthy. He also argued that we're not prisoners of the childhood. We talked about that already in this video. Gordon Allport said it's pointless to talk about childhood. Healthy people don't resemble their childhood selves at all. Third reason, he said you shouldn't even study abnormal psychology. Why? Because most people aren't abnormal. Wrong, because nowadays we know that over 80% of people at some point in their life will admit to having some form of a psychological disorder. And that's the people that will admit to it. So I'm going to disagree with you there, Allport. That's my point. That's all I'm saying. Now that we had these three premises that you shouldn't talk about the unconscious, childhood doesn't matter, unhealthy people don't matter, well, now we can talk about the nitty-gritty details of his theory and his nature of personality. He did make a strong argument that there is a combination of nature and nurture, heredity and environment, genes and upbringing all matter. They combine. Specifically, he talked about this analogy that your genetics is clay and the environment are the hands that shape that clay into whatever you want. Professor Gooding, me, I'm really good at making snakes, worms, and noodles with clay. This show's not about me. Let's move on. What did he call personality? He called it a dynamic organization within an individual. A dynamic organization, dynamic meaning growing and changing and altering. Hence his whole premise that we're snowflakes. We're all different. Another big component of his idea of personality, there are two distinct personalities in a human being. There's their childhood self, and then there's their adult self. The two are, again, totally different. The acorn compared to the oak tree. Traits, the distinguishing characteristics that guide behavior. That's what he called traits. He used to call them common traits, but he thought, no, that's pretty self-explanatory. We're not going to call them common traits anymore. You don't need that extra label of common traits. Common traits are traits that everyone shares, but if you think of traits as nothing but adjectives, then everyone shares these adjectives in some way. Speed, height, weight, humor, sexiness, etc. He did talk about individual traits, though. And this is how we're unique, because some traits, some people have that others don't. And he later renamed these as personal dispositions. There's 3 different types of personal dispositions. It seems like this Gordon Allport character really likes the number 3. So here's the 3 personal dispositions. Cardinal traits. Not everyone has a cardinal trait, and they're not always good. Cardinal trait is if there's one single word that you can use to describe someone so thoroughly well. This one word basically, boom, encompasses their entire personality. This is where paranoid personality comes in. Someone with paranoid personality disorder, I don't want to oversimplify it, but you can explain those individuals in one word. That one word, paranoid. Then Trudy has her friend, we all do, that has their entire personality based around pizza. I'm all about pizza. Pizza this, pizza that. Is there going to be pizza there? Man, I haven't gone 8 hours without pizza in the last 3 years. We get it. You're the pizza fanatic. We may also think of sadism or antisocial personality disorder this way. Their entire being is all about hurting others. That's an oversimplification for antisocial personality disorder, but if someone's a pure sadist and they only get pleasure out of hurting others and that's all they're really doing all day, that's unique and strong enough to be a cardinal trait. Then there's central traits. Everyone has central traits. Try it right now. Think of 5 words that describe you best. Honest, anxious, competitive, perfectionistic, whatever they may be. Point is, if you can think of like 3 to 5 words that mostly describe someone, that's more of the central traits. Not as severe as the cardinal traits, but still very specific. And then the rest of it are secondary traits. These are near invisible preferences. These are the things you don't even know about someone until you've lived with them or you interact with them enough. For instance, Trudy hates 7-Up, but she loves Sprite. If you gave me a taste test between 7-Up and Sprite, I'm not sure if I could tell the difference, but she has this near invisible preference for Sprite. That's an example of a secondary trait. What seat do you prefer in the movie theater? Do you fold your toilet paper or do you wad it? None of my business really, but that is secondary trait. So that's Allport's ideas of traits. Now we want to talk about his vocabulary term he called functional autonomy. Autonomy. If you remember Professor Gooding's definition of autonomy, it means being master of your own destiny. So if you combine that, master of your own destiny, with functional, it means being the functional master of your own destiny. What the heck does that mean? Long story short, I believe when Allport said functional autonomy, he simply meant a healthy way of being. So think of it as healthy being. Functional autonomy, healthy being. Remember, Allport said you shouldn't even research people that aren't healthy, that have psychological disorders. So if you have functional autonomy, then you're not one of these people. So we have 3 other things we're going to learn. Again, the number 3 with Gordon Allport. There's the functional autonomy of motives, appropriate functional autonomy, and last but not least, perseverative functional autonomy. Functional autonomy of motives is him just reiterating that the motives of a healthy person are that of an adult. If you are not a healthy person, then your motives are caught up in childhood or some disorder. To understand one's motivation is to understand that person. According to Allport, you are what you want to do. His specific definition for the functional autonomy of motives is the idea that motives in the normal mature adult are independent of the childhood experiences in which they originally appeared. The acorn versus the oak tree. Perseverative functional autonomy. These habits that we have where we don't even remember why we do them. An example Gordon Allport gave was making our bed. You still make your bed. Does your mom still reward you? Saying, good work, you made your bed, you're amazing. No, you don't even have that. Instead, you're doing it because the reward is more intrinsic at this point. Persevere is the root word here. Persevere meaning it's still there. If you persevere through something, you just stick to it. That stick-to-ited, healthy way of being. So it's motivation that remains even without the original motivator, to the point where we don't even know why we do the things that we do. When do you put your socks on versus your pants? Put your socks on first, your pants on. Finally, we have appropriate functional autonomy. Appropriate. Gordon Allport made up the word appropriate. Root, I think where he was coming from was appropriate. So what's the appropriate functional autonomy? What is the appropriate functional self? According to Gordon Allport, his word for the self is proprium. Another made-up word. Remember, he's the pioneer in the field of personality psychology. So he's making up all of these terms to help explain how he thinks personality works. Of course, we've gotten rid of a lot of these things. But again, as a student of the psychology of personality, you need to know that Gordon Allport's word for self is proprium. Now let's talk about your proprium. You got 3 more principles. Jeez, Gordon, with the 3s already. 3 principles with appropriate functional autonomy. Who are you? Remember, he said you are what you like to do. So these 3 principles of appropriate functional autonomy are going to have everything to do with how you spend your time. These are actually in steps. So there's first, second, third. First step is organizing the energy level. What are you doing? What are you investing your energy in? This sounds very similar to Carl Jung's principle of equivalence. Where am I investing my time? Second, mastery and competence. This is you keep doing it so you get good at it. What are you practicing right now? Ideally, you're practicing psychology or personality. Then after you try it and try it and try it, eventually you get good enough with it. Then comes step 3, where you identify with it. Maybe at first you were just kind of shooting hoops to kill time. But you enjoyed it enough. You decided, I'm going to start practicing this and get good at it. I got to roll the wrist. But eventually, you spend so much time playing basketball that you realize, you know what I am? I'm a basketball player. Are you a musician? Are you an artist? Are you a smart ass? What are the things that you practice that you're good at that you now have absorbed into your identity? Now, as a side note, this kind of leads to a conversation about how people can go through an identity crisis when they lose their capability to do something with which they really identify. For instance, some ice skater or gymnast that ruins their hip or ankle or leg and they can no longer do it for the rest of their life, they inevitably might ask themselves, if I don't have ice skating or gymnastics, who am I? This is the scary thing of individuals that really spend a lot of their time relying on their physical abilities, because eventually as you get older and older, you're not going to be able to rely on those physical abilities as well. All right, let's talk about Allport's assessment. How did he do his research? What did he do with his clients? He did a whole bunch of stuff like self-appraisal, ratings, tests, scales, depth analysis, expressive behavior. Remember, he worked for Harvard. He wanted to keep it clinical, empirically sound. But the one thing that he really invested time in was personal documents. What the hell are personal documents? You ever been doxxed before? Doxing, or the personal document technique, is when you extract traits and motivations by reviewing a person's written or spoken words. Basically, you look at everything you can of them. Heck, it can even be credit card statements, seeing what they spent their money on. And remember, according to Gordon Allport, where you spend your time and energy is a lot of who you are. That is your proprium. Then you have those 3 principles of appropriate functional autonomy. It's all connected. So by looking at someone's personal documents, diary, gold. That's a perfect example of personal document technique. And using that, he would review his clients and other individuals and see what kind of perhaps traits they had and how they were falling upon the 3 principles of the appropriate functional autonomy, etc. And that's it. That's all I really want you to know about Gordon Allport. So real quick review. Life of Allport, he didn't want to share a lot of his childhood because he said it's not important. Perhaps why did he say it wasn't important? He was so offended with his interaction with Freud, he decided to be another anti-Freud. Unconscious is stupid. Childhood is pointless. We're not a slave to childhood, right? And I stopped talking about unhealthy people. Let's talk about healthy individuals. Then we talked about his nature of personality, his idea of nature and nurture working together, nature being the clay and nurture being the hands that sculpt that clay. We talked about personality traits, the difference between cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. He talked about functional autonomy, the functional autonomy of motives, that we are as different from our childhood as the oak tree is from the acorn. It sounds repetitive, but hey, now you remember it. We also talked about perseverative functional autonomy, those near invisible preferences that you don't really see someone has until you know them. And we also talked about appropriate functional autonomy. And last but not least, we talked about how Gordon Allport used personal documents, doxing, to get to know individuals. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to pound that subscribe button, leave a comment, questions, whatever you want to. Do all that stuff. I'm Professor Alan Girding, and I love psychology.